This is Bloomberg Businessweek Daily, reporting from the magazine that helps global leaders stay ahead, with insight on the people, companies, and trends shaping today's complex economy, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Businessweek Daily with Carol Massar and Tim Stenivek, live on Bloomberg Radio, television, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals.
And a very good afternoon, everybody, live across Bloomberg platforms. I'm Carol Massar. Tim Stenivek is off today, and with us is Bloomberg News cross-asset reporter Emily Graffeo. Emily, on a day where, yes, we are watching the markets, but we are watching what's going out on the west, all the way west. We're talking about Anchorage, Alaska, because we are awaiting President Putin and President Trump to hold their meeting.
Yeah, that's right. And it seems like markets are waiting as well, because if you look at how the trade is going today, the S&P 500 is basically flat. Tech stocks are falling a little bit. We're going to get into all of this, Carol, right?
We are indeed. We did have a record on the Dow Jones Industrial Average, so that index is certainly up today. Hey, we are going to head to Anchorage, Alaska. We are going to have a scene setter with our own Annmarie Hordern, who is on the ground. And in terms of economic news, we did get a read, Emily, on retail sales, and we've got a great voice on that.
Yeah, we're going to talk to Dana Telsey, founder, CEO, and chief research officer of Telsey Advisory Group. She is one of our go-tos here on anything retail. We're also going to talk United Health, those shares getting a shot in the arm after Warren Buffett and other big investors have bought in.
Yeah, this is certainly a standout in today's session. Open Door also rallying. The CEO is out. So we've got Eric Jackson back with us to talk about that story. All right, folks, all of that to come in the next 60 minutes. Let's get you going on a look at that trading session on this Friday. Here is Charlie Pellet.
All right, thank you very much. Lots going on, and we got you covered here at Bloomberg. We've got the Dow, as Carol mentioned, trading at a record. We begin there up 159 right now, higher by about 0.4%. But on a day that has brought us a lot of economic data, S&P 500 index, lower little change, retreating from a record, 64.63 where we stand right now. S&P down 4, down under 0.1%. Little change, perhaps the key takeaway there. Little changed indeed near a record. We've got NASDAQ down 47 for the NASDAQ Composite Index. That's a drop of 0.2%. The Russell 2000 Index of small cap shares down 0.3%. And our Mag 7 Index, little changed on the day, down under 0.1%. The 10-year 4.32% with the 2-year that's currently yielding 3.74%. Gold flat on the day, 33.36 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude down 1.5%, 63.02 a barrel on WTI. So again, recapping here, we do have U.S. equities. It is a mixed day with the Dow at a record up 153. The Dow, by the way, at 45,062. If we close at that level, that would indeed be a record up 0.3%. But S&P little change, down 0.1%. For on-demand news, 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right. Thank you so much, Charlie Pellet, there with an update on today's trading session. I'm Carol Massar along with Emily Graffeo in for Tim today. Let's take a look at certainly our top stories today. And that is the meeting between President Putin and President Trump. We are kind of keeping an eye on the tarmac in Alaska, awaiting the arrival of both officials. So as soon as they do touch ground, we know it's quite a trip, certainly from the nation's capital for President Trump. He left early this morning. President Putin expected to land shortly. So keeping a watch on when they do indeed touch ground. And we will, of course, keep you any headlines from that meeting, bring them to you. In the meantime, in Anchorage, Alaska, she's been there. Bloomberg Surveillance co-host Annmarie Hordern. Annmarie, first of all, set the scene for us. What have you seen? What have you heard since you landed?
Well, the scene is really around a U.S. military base. This is where the two individuals, the two leaders, will be meeting. This is going to be the first time Putin has stepped foot in U.S. soil since 2015. He last met with President Obama at the UN General Assembly, and it's the first meeting between Trump and Putin since Trump's return to office. So there is a lot of trepidation, I would say, on both sides about the outcome of this meeting. You just had the president speaking to Fox News on Air Force One on his way to Anchorage, saying if the meeting's not going well, he says, I'm going to walk. And he did say that in an earlier interview as well this saying there's even a 25% chance that the interview is negative and he'll give a singular press conference, a solo press conference. What we've heard from Yuri Yushchykov, who is a key foreign policy aide for decades to President Putin, briefing reporters earlier this week, they said that the plan is for these two leaders to meet one-on-one, and then you would have the U.S. and Russian delegations have an extended bilateral meeting together, and then the two would give a joint press conference. We also heard from Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, who said the meetings could last, Carol, as long as to 6 to 7 hours between these two delegations.
Annmarie, what about Trump kind of mentioning that now he's thinking that we'll have more than just one meeting? Talk about the timeline here. If we're going to have additional meetings, what really is the significance of what we see today?
Well, today, for the president, he said this is really a feel-out meeting. The White House has described it as a listening session for the president, and the president has been downplaying and really lowering the bar of the expectation of what could come from this meeting. Really, the best case for this White House is that at this meeting, Putin agrees to actual diplomatic process to bring this war to an end. But why people are calling this a high-stakes meeting, including the president himself, is because when you have two leaders meeting for a summit, it usually should be pretty boring. They should be signing an agreement that their teams have for months or years have been working on. Shuttle diplomacy takes a very long time, but this is really the start of that longer process, and that would be the best outcome. And the president's talking about the real meeting would be a secondary meeting. What he wants to deliver today is a secondary meeting where President Zelensky can be at the table. There's been a lot of discussion about a territorial swap and what that could look like. This is really a red line, I would say the third rail for Zelensky and as well as European leaders. The president was asked about this on Air Force One, and he said territorial swaps will come up in conversation, but it's not for him to decide. It's for Zelensky to decide. It's his job to get these two to the table.
Yeah, there's the elephant in the room in Anchorage or on the tarmac. President Zelensky is not there. The significance of that, Annmarie.
Some folks that were testing in the mall.
Well, really, he's not here, but his views, he hopes, will be represented by President Trump. And it would be a win for Zelensky if President Trump is able to deliver a second meeting where Zelensky is at the table with Vladimir Putin. We heard from Friedrich Merz this morning as the German chancellor. He was one of those individuals on that call with President Trump earlier this week with European leaders, and they really implored on the president to not give in on territorial exchanges. That is for Ukraine to do. So that for the European capitals is also a red line. But yes, he is not here. This is one stark difference between the Biden administration and the Trump administration. Trump does want to make sure he's having these conversations with President Putin. Moscow is almost viewing what's going on in Ukraine as only one agenda item. They want to talk about bilateral relationships and restart them with the United States. In February of next year, you have New START that is going to be expiring. They want to talk about nuclear arms. They want to talk about arms proliferation. They want to talk about geopolitical and energy cooperation. We're just south of the Arctic Circle. The Arctic is incredibly important for Russia as well as for the United States when it comes to access to rare minerals. So they view what's going on in Ukraine as just one piece of the puzzle. But when the president was asked about the fact that he said business leaders will be coming along with Putin, I think there's only going to be one business leader, who's Kirill Dmitriev, who's the head of the RDIF. He said there will not be any business, though, until the war is over. So the president is making sure that that is top of the agenda.
Fascinating to hear that. All right, we're going to be watching. We know you will, and we will be coming back to you throughout the day. Annmarie Hordern, thank you so much. She is there in Anchorage, Alaska, as we await both of those leaders to touch down on the tarmac in Anchorage, Alaska. Again, President Putin and President Trump. All right, joining us now, the conversation continues. Elise Giuliano, she is senior lecturer in political science at Columbia University, also director of graduate studies at Columbia's Harriman Institute for Russian, Eurasian, and East European Studies, and director of the program. She joins us here in studio. This summit, it feels like even if something significant doesn't get done, it's significant in that we are seeing these two leaders meet face to face. Is it?
It's certainly a departure from the normal turn of diplomacy. Usually,
why do you say that?
Because the summit, usually the lower level diplomats hammer out what will be decided ahead of time, and they go into the summit knowing the outcome. Here, nobody knows what to expect, least of all Trump. And that is not a very good place to be. We want to know. We don't like the feeling of insecurity. So I think Trump is thinking about this not as a summit, but in a different way. Just like, let me talk to him, see what he's thinking, kind of get the sense of things and see if I can make some progress. So for Trump, it's very typical for his kind of a sort of shoot from the hip personal relations approach, but it's not what international diplomats would expect from a summit.
How would you categorize the current status of the Trump and Putin relationship, particularly because heading into this meeting, there's a lot of columnists out there who are calling this already a diplomatic win for Putin just because he's coming on U.S. soil and just because he's agreed to this meeting?
Well, I would say that it's a win. I don't love that term, but it's a win in the sense that this is a war not just on the battlefield, but it's a war of narratives. And Russia's narrative is that Ukraine is not a country, and Ukrainians are not a people. They're not a nation. And by not having Ukraine at the table, at the summit, and instead having the U.S., it feeds that narrative. Like, they're not here because they're not a country. Zelensky's not here because he's not a legitimate leader of a country. And in fact, for Russia and for Putin especially, Ukraine is part of Russia. So that's the narrative he's pushing, and the summit kind of feeds into that. And it's a win in the sense that Putin can take that message to his population. He can take it to other audiences around the world, like North Korea, like Iran, like China, and say, look, I'm a superpower. Russia's back in the game. We were a superpower, and we're a superpower again.
Elise, how much of this is about optics? Certainly for President Trump as well as President Putin, in terms of European leaders watching, China watching, Iran watching. Like, I just think about, how important it is in terms of how this comes out for each of these leaders, and how they are perceived around the world.
I think what I was talking about, definitely is about optics for Russia. Even though it's an authoritarian country, they have to be somewhat concerned about what the population thinks. And lately, Ukraine has been taking the war to Russia and disrupting flights. Even some civilians have been killed. Well, not many civilians. I would say there's been some activity on the territory of Russia, and that makes the war less popular. So it's optics, but it's also, I think that Putin is really trying to get something out of the U.S., trying to convince Trump, that Russia's position is the correct one. And if he can do that, he would make a lot of progress today.
Meaning the position of a land grab?
Yeah.
Because he already succeeded with the Crimean Peninsula back in 2014. And so here it is, a second one. So is that the end game for him, to kind of get back? It's not an expansion of territory as he sees it. It's going back to land that used to belong to
So that's his claim, that this land used to belong.
Right, yeah. That's his claim.
So part of this is about territory, and that's certainly one of the demands, of Russia's demands, that they're asking for territory. And they're even making the outrageous claim that they want some of the territory that they don't even control militarily,
right,
in Donetsk and in some of the other areas in the east. But there's also a political demand, also outrageous. And that political demand is that Ukraine cannot join the West, it cannot join NATO, and it cannot join Europe. So again, it's saying Ukraine is not a country. It doesn't have the right to make sovereign decisions for itself.
We are talking with Elise Giuliano. She's senior lecturer in political science at Columbia University. So having said that, will anything in your view come out of this meeting? If that is the position of President Putin, that's a tough one for the U.S. to even maybe concede to, potentially.
It's something the U.S. should not concede, and use the right term there, because it would be a massive concession, and that's not a place we want to be, right? We want to be defending state sovereignty. We want to be defending a European ally, Ukraine. I think that the U.S., though, really has leverage, and Trump really needs to use that leverage, and he started to. He put 50% tariff on India for buying Russian oil and gas. And there's a lot of leverage. Like, let's keep in mind that Russia's economy is the size of Italy, and that was before the sanctions. So there's a lot more the U.S. can do in terms of sanctions. There's a lot more the U.S. can do in terms of armaments and military support for Ukraine.
And we, Emily, as you know, at Bloomberg have done a lot of reporting about the Russian economy that's really stalling because of that diminishing oil revenue. So he is in economically a tight spot.
Yeah, to what extent does that help Trump and the U.S. here and actually finding some success out of this summit?
I think if the U.S. and if Trump realizes that Russia is not the Soviet Union, I mean, it does have nuclear weapons, and this is a a difficult point, but
it has a lot of nuclear weapons.
It does, and I think that's why the Biden administration was so cautious in its support for Ukraine. But I think that understanding Russia's economy and, in fact, that its GDP is dropping and that it's in a tough spot would help the U.S. to understand the forms of leverage it has. So it could really turn the screws. And I think Trump is coming around to this.
The President Trump could have turned the screws last Friday, right? There was a sanctions deadline that came and went.
Exactly, with no comment by Trump.
Exactly.
Right. So it's interesting that instead of commenting on this, on the possibility of further sanctions for China or for India, these secondary sanctions, instead they said, oh, let's have a bilateral summit, which just seems like a gift for Putin. So this is why Europe and I think Ukraine have been a bit nervous about the outcome of this summit.
Is there a possibility at all then, in your view, that Zelensky does get to join a meeting? Maybe not this one, but maybe in the future, particularly if Putin is deliberately trying to not have him included in these talks.
And President Trump seemed to indicate that European allies could come in, or President Zelensky.
Right.
So Trump understands now that it's important for Europe and Ukraine to have a seat at the table in its own war. But I think the problem... You
smile when you say that, but it is kind of crazy when we think about it. But go ahead.
It is. It is. But I think the problem, again, is Putin. He has never recognized Zelensky as the legitimate elected leader of Ukraine. And so to sit across, for Putin to sit across the table from Zelensky gives Ukraine as a state legitimacy, it gives Zelensky legitimacy, and that undercuts the narrative of Ukraine being, again, an illegitimate state and part of Russia.
You are a study of Russia, and I feel like we can study countries, but we can study leaders, and they tell us so much. What do we need to understand about Vladimir Putin?
Well, Putin is a very transactional leader, although in this case...
So it's a good match.
It can be a good match, and that's why you see this summit happening also, right? Because we hear that Russia is coming with the idea of selling the U.S. on some economic deals, right? So they kind of see that they can do business with Trump. But at the same time, I think we really do need to understand that Putin has been intransigent from the beginning of this war in terms of Ukraine. He doesn't always know it seems that he doesn't always know what's going on the battlefield, and he is committed. And they have said there's not going to be anything signed out of this meeting. They said it. So there's not going to be a ceasefire. There's not going to be a kind of agreement. Perhaps the most we can hope for is a continuation of conversation, and perhaps Russia realizing that the Trump administration will start to exert the leverage that it does have.
It's a really good reminder. I feel like our expectations have been managed in a big way, right? Kind of going into this. So, and I feel like the president has said that over and over again, the idea of the second meeting. So I guess to be continued. But we got to wait and see what happens here. Elise, thank you so much. Really enjoyed this. Elise Giuliano, Senior Lecturer in Political Science at Columbia University, also Director of Graduate Studies at Columbia's Harriman Institute for Russian, Eurasian, and East European Studies, Director of the Program on U.S.-Russia Relations, joining us in studios. Thank you so much. All right, folks, we continue to watch the tarmac there in Alaska, waiting for those leaders to land. As soon as they do, we will let you know. In the meantime, we've been watching that retail sales number that came out this morning, and also downbeat consumer sentiment numbers. Great voice on everything retail. Dana Telsey will be with us when Bloomberg Businessweek Daily continues. I'm Carol Massar with Emily Graffeo.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow Jones Industrial Average at a record 45,017. Big question, will we close above or below 45,000? Stick around, find out at the close. Right now, looking at an advance of 104 in the Dow. That is a gain of 0.2%. However, Stocks, for the most part, lower now, with the S&P down 11, 64.57 where we stand right now, drop there of 0.2%. Stocks pulling back from records as consumer sentiment fell for the first time since April. NASDAQ down 79, drop there of 0.4%. Our Mag 7 index in the red, down 0.3%. The Russell 2000 index of small cap shares also lower, down 0.4. The Dow, however, at a record up 0.2%. The 10-year at 4.32%, with the 2-year 3.75%. And West Texas Intermediate crude oil right now down by 1.6%, down 103 a barrel, 62.94. The price of Bitcoin right now down 0.5%, 117,413 per token. United Health Group shares jumping after funds piled into the company, which has been hampered by a federal probe into its business practices and weakening results. United Healthcare surging 13.6%, again giving a lift to the Dow at a record up 0.2%. Keeping it all in context, S&P down 0.2. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Carol Massar, Emily Graffeo in for Tim on this Friday. We are watching Anchorage, Alaska, of course, awaiting that meeting between Presidents Putin and President Trump. We just have a live shot of the tarmac. Just moments ago, we saw Air Force One move across the tarmac. So President Trump is on the ground there in Anchorage. He has a list of officials with him from the White House. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Secretary of Treasury Scott Bessent, Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick, also John Ratcliffe. So again, he and his team are there on the ground as they get ready to meet with President Putin. We will, of course, monitor and bring you all of the headlines. In the meantime, at 8:30 a.m. Eastern this morning, we got a headline on retail sales for the month of July, and they were solid, broad-based advance, and the prior month was revised higher, though economists were cautious on the trend going forward given a softening jobs market and weaker consumer sentiment. We did see U.S. sentiment falling for the first time since April. And then we've heard from CEOs, Emily, Pandora, Tapestry, a lot of folks talking about the impact of tariffs.
Yeah, and particularly I keep hearing the word economic uncertainty, and I don't know if that's something that you hear every earnings season, but it feels like it's something that these C-suite executives have been bringing up more and more.
Let's ask Dana Telsey. She knows retail like no other. She is founder, CEO, and chief research officer of Telsey Advisory Group. She's with us in New York City. Dana, thank you so much for joining us on this Friday. When CEOs are talking about the economy, do they always kind of talk about it, or do you feel like we're seeing more momentum around some of those earnings releases about concerns about the consumer and the economy?
Thank you for having me. And yes, I agree with your take. You're definitely hearing more commentary that continues to be increasing quarter to quarter about the uncertainty of the economy. What you've heard from CEOs this week and a little bit last week, and we'll have a lot more next week, is that spending and sales since the end of the June quarter has improved and it's increased. Some of this may be because the pull forward of sales, given the price increases from tariffs, are not yet fully there. And you've also heard the volatility. For example, maybe like April and May was weak, but then June and July picked up. And is the new normal going to be volatility and then improvement, volatility and then improvement? The lack of consistency makes it difficult for C-level executives to plan their businesses and give guidance.
But help us understand, I mean, it's been a couple months since Liberation Day. We've been dealing with tariffs. Is all of this uncertainty still linked to consumers just looking at tariffs, businesses looking at tariffs, and still not understanding exactly how those are going to affect their businesses?
Well, there's a couple things. First of all, what you're seeing companies do is they're diversifying their sourcing. And as they're diversifying their sourcing, many of them pulled out of China, went other places. The tariff rate went higher than China, and now some of them are bringing back their sourcing to China. Second thing is we do a tracker of 80 items each week that we price. We've been doing this since April 16th. And one of the things you're seeing is our pricing, and they're iconic goods, whether a Levi's 501 jean or a Barbie doll. You've been seeing prices begin to go up. Certainly on footwear, we've seen that, and we expect it to continue to increase going forward. You had Amazon Prime Day this year. 4 days instead of 2 days. And the first 2 days versus last year were up double digits. So consumers are taking advantage of deals that they may think they're getting now, coupled with newness in product like closed-toed Birkenstocks, where they're buying some of the new items that they wouldn't have had before and were just introduced, that's capturing the interest of a younger consumer. So there's a mix of things that are going on to create this dynamic of what's happening to sales.
We are talking with Dana Telsey of Telsey Advisory Group, talking retail. We will continue in just a moment. In the meantime, we want to take you to Anchorage, Alaska. We have seen the door open on Air Force One. It has landed there. So the President Trump and his team are there on the ground. We should point you, are waiting their departure from Air Force One. Coming up, there will be a ceremony with President Trump and President Putin. We are expected on the tarmac, and we are expecting then that to be followed by a bilateral meeting between the two leaders, also a lunch meeting, and then, depending on how that meeting goes, we could see a joint press conference. We did hear from President Trump yesterday and earlier about the outcome will determine whether or not we will see both leaders in a news conference later on this evening. Bloomberg will be all over this coverage, and keep yourself here for all of the headlines. Again, the door is open on Air Force One. We reminded all of you that the president's there with a whole host of his cabinet. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is there. The Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is there. The Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick is there. Susie Wiles, John Ratcliffe is also there. Caroline Leavitt of his press secretary and of the media office is there as well. So he is there with, it looks like, about a dozen officials from the White House. Ambassador Steve Witkoff is there. Ambassador Monica Crowley is also there. So again, his whole team, Emily, is certainly there in full force as they get ready to meet with President Putin.
And Carol, according to the White House press pool, the one-on-one meeting between Trump and Putin is now set to be a 1-on-3 encounter. Rubio and Steve Witkoff are scheduled to join. All
right, so interesting, because we've been certainly speculating about who would be indeed in that meeting. So again, our live blog here on the Bloomberg, as Emily mentioned, that it will be a one-on-one meeting between President Trump and Putin, and now 1-on-3 encounter is what it's turned into, according to the White House press pool. Secretary Rubio and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff are scheduled to join. And then the White House has said that the president is due to hold a joint press conference with President Putin after the meeting. If it takes place, it will certainly be something we will be watching closely, since the last time we saw a meeting between these officials. So we'll be watching it and bringing you any of the headlines. We do want to get back to talking about the U.S. consumer and retail. Dana Telsey is still with us of the Telsey Advisory Group. Dana, so the retail sales numbers, again, it's an interesting number, and it could be that people are just paying higher prices for everything. Would you say, in a nutshell, if you kind of roll in the U.S. consumer sentiment feelings, down for the first time since April, they're concerned about inflation, consumers are, that the U.S. consumer is largely cautious?
Yes, they are. They're more discerning and cautious consumer. They're more selective in their spending. And you're seeing it, whether it's in restaurants, you're seeing it in some travel, and you're seeing it in the purchase of goods. More to come this upcoming week, given that Target, Walmart, all reporting their results, and Estee Lauder. So more to come in dissecting what it looks like.
Dana, I have to get your thoughts on the Tapestry earnings that we saw just earlier this week. What did you make of kind of that divergence in their two businesses? The Coach brand has been so popular with Gen Z. It feels like everyone wants to buy a Coach bag now, but the Kate Spade brand really pulling back. Just walk us through high-level thoughts there on what you made of those earnings.
When you think of Tapestry, it's a portfolio company with two brands, like you said, Coach and also Kate Spade. The Coach brand up double digits. The Coach brand seeing average unit retail selling prices increase, capturing more new customers and going from strength to strength by adding items in their collections that allow them to have a consistent and sustainable business model. The Kate Spade brand is only 15% of sales. More of their goods are sold in the United States, making them more impactful impactful to tariffs. And that was definitely one of the headwinds. And they have to set the transformation. The surprise was they lost money in the quarter. There's a reset going on. It's taking longer than expected. You're going to have this upcoming fiscal year where you're going to need to see stabilization markers of what the brand is, while they also try to lean into the Coach playbook and utilize some of those learnings to update and improve Kate Spade. More to come, but 85% of the business is Coach, and that's growing.
All right. In terms of earnings, just one last question, 30 seconds. What's the big one next week?
It's going to be Walmart and Target. Is Target going to talk about a successor? Is Walmart still seeing growth in food? And they seem to be the market share gainer at Walmart.
All right, going to leave it there. Dana, thank you so much. Dana Telsey, CEO and Chief Research Officer of Telsey Advisory Group, joining us in New York City. All right, folks, we want to go back to certainly the tarmac in Alaska. We know President Trump's plane, Air Force One, is on the ground there. The door is open. We are waiting the president to step out there and meet. We are assuming President Putin is either there or close to being there, because they are expected to meet on the tarmac. Let's head to our co-host of Balance of Power, Joe Mathieu, who is, of course, watching this and doing special coverage throughout the evening here at Bloomberg. Joe, we're awaiting President Trump at the top of those stairs.
That's right. He's been in the plane for a little more than 7 hours after taking off a bit late this morning, which has pushed the schedule a touch. Vladimir Putin, by the way, not flying from Moscow. To your point, he is supposed to be there imminently, having taken off from Magadan in eastern Russia, about 2,000 miles away from Anchorage. And how about the optics here? It almost looks like the beginning of an Olympic event with the staging set, the big letters, Alaska 2025. They've got 4 American fighter jets out there, and now Air Force One rolling up to a red carpet that was literally being rolled out just a couple of moments ago. The trappings here when it comes to the optics are very important, and even more so because it's Donald Trump on that airplane. He really wants to make this a stage for him to express not only American power, but his own position as a statesman here, a statesman for the world, as he sits down with another world leader. I will tell you guys that things have changed a little bit in terms of the construct of this meeting. They're still going to be one-on-one together, and we're not sure exactly what the area is or what the room is going to look like that they'll be sitting in. But there are a number of folks with the president, a big entourage, including Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Treasury Secretary Bessent, Commerce Secretary Lutnick, Steve Witkoff, his envoy, who's come to know Vladimir Putin quite well. They're going to have what they're calling a working lunch with their Russian counterparts following this meeting between Trump and Putin. It's unclear how long that's going to go. We are still waiting for a bilateral news conference with Trump and Putin together. It'll be their first since Helsinki, which John Bolton reminded us today is something he regarded as the darkest day of the first Trump administration, the first Trump term. And all of this is helping inform what's going to take place today. I'll be deeply curious to see the president's posture, to see the expression on his face, to see if there's smiling or backslapping, or if this is a bit of a cold get-together here. We know that Vladimir Putin has been showering the president with compliments and has been trying to soften up his arrival here today in Anchorage. But this is just about to start, guys, and it's a truly historic day in Alaska.
Yeah, certainly historic. And it was interesting. I think I heard on your program earlier on Balance of Power, Joe, that this idea of, to see the U.S. Fighter jets there on the tarmac at a time when we know Russian President Vladimir Putin is strained when it comes to military operations and air power in particular in that fight with Ukraine.
Hey, so Joe.
And has been calling for... Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Joe.
He's been calling for an air truce, in fact, which is something that could be expressed at this meeting today. It's unclear. And the idea of fighting raging on the ground while there's a truce in the sky might be something that could at least protect civilians. I think that's how this was being framed, because Vladimir Putin continues to send missiles into civilian neighborhoods and apartment buildings. But it's very unclear if anything short of a ceasefire would be acceptable today to Ukraine.
So, Joe, the one-on-one meeting here, it was going to be a one-on-one meeting between Trump and Putin, now set to be a three-on-three encounter, at least according to the White House press poll. We do want to correct, we had said that it would be a there would be one participant from the Russian side. Now it looks to be a three-on-three encounter. What's the significance of now more officials being added to the meeting?
Yeah, it's hard to tell, and I'm glad that you mentioned that. This is something that just developed a short time ago, that Marco Rubio And interestingly, Pete Hegseth, they mention, is there because he was not on the Air Force One list. But Rubio and Witkoff will be joining the president. Having the Secretary of State present for a meeting like this should not be considered unusual. Steve Witkoff, as the special envoy, is going to play a role in this meeting because, as I mentioned, he's become quite friendly with Vladimir Putin following some very extended sessions that they have held one-on-one in Moscow. So it does change the dynamic a bit to consider that you'll have Trump, Rubio, Witkoff with their Russian counterparts in the room. The matter of Pete Hegseth is curious. This is going to be an expanded bilateral working lunch that they're talking about that will come later. Trump, Rubio, Hegseth, Bessent, Lutnick, the Chief of Staff, Susie Wiles, and a few others. That could go on for some time. So it's unclear to us that we could be talking about this in the wee hours of the morning tomorrow by the time these guys hit the podium.
You know, it's interesting. We just had Elise Giuliano from Columbia University. She's an expert on Russian studies, European studies, and she mentioned that President Putin is a transactional president. And, you know, many have called President Trump a transactional president. So it is interesting that they both come to the table wanting different things, but you wonder how much of that is going to be at odds, Joe.
Well, and that's, a big question that we have is how much business is going to be discussed. I know you guys were getting into that earlier because this could be seen as a real point of leverage for Donald Trump. The Russian economy is in a shambles right now and has been for some time. And the idea of doing business with the United States might seem very attractive to a Vladimir Putin who doesn't necessarily have a lot of interest in ending this war in Ukraine. He's been ramping up attacks on Ukraine and trying to gain as much leverage militarily as he can. But to suddenly find the Commerce Secretary in Anchorage today, the Treasury Secretary, these were not the names that we suspected that we would be talking about. And Vladimir Putin also has floated the idea of some sort of arms control agreement coming out of this. So we've got a lot of cross currents that may not necessarily involve Ukraine in the conversations that are going to be happening today. And frankly, that makes Europeans nervous, and it certainly makes President Zelensky nervous.
Right. When we think about the leverage here that the U.S. has, what exactly comes to mind? What can Trump really use in negotiations right now?
Well, look, it's a good question, and I'm not sure exactly what it is that he's going to be proposing. But the idea of secondary sanctions that the president has hanging over Moscow right now is probably the beginning of that answer. The idea of sanctioning the countries like India and China who buy Russian oil and staving off what is really the feedstock and the money line to what even now Donald Trump refers to as the Russian war machine. If they can't sell oil, they're going to be in much more dire straits economically than they are now. The idea, though, of being brought back into the fold, so to speak, to be seen as not a pariah on the world stage and maybe do business with the Western world could seem very attractive to Vladimir Putin. But let's remember, too, President Trump has talked about that second meeting. And it's not likely that we're going to have the framework of a deal unless, look, maybe they have some kind of massive breakthrough in the room today. We'll allow for anything because we just don't know. But even Trump himself has suggested the second meeting would likely be more productive and could also include Volodymyr Zelensky.
What will you be watching out for as this evolves over the next few hours?
Well, look, the body language will be everything, right? I want to see these two on the tarmac and see what this interaction is like. And then they're going to disappear for a while, and it could be hours. So we're going to be watching for how they seem when they emerge and into the briefing room that has been set up. By the way, we have had a look at it. There are a lot of chairs set up for reporters and a relatively small-looking stage, a blue backdrop behind the stage with the American and Russian flags. And it says, "Pursuing Peace." That's what you'll see reading over their two heads as they're taking questions from reporters. Is this going to be a repeat of Helsinki, or would it be more like when the president went to meet with Kim Jong-un? He walked out on that meeting when he didn't find the terms that he wanted in a nuclear deal. We're allowing for both extremes today and everything in between. And we're going to find out live together here on Bloomberg.
We are talking with Joe Mathieu. He is co-host of Bloomberg's Balance of Power. Joe will be doing special coverage from 5 to 9 p.m. this evening following these meetings between the two presidents. In the meantime, we've got a live shot for those who are listening on radio of Air Force One. The door is open. The president's been on the tarmac now for some time. I would say 10, 15, 20 minutes at this point, traveling with a large delegation of his cabinet, and we are waiting for his arrival. We are expecting he and President Putin to exchange greetings on the tarmac, a welcoming ceremony, if you will, there in Anchorage, Alaska. I mean, Joe, you know, one of the things that we've been talking about constantly is that typically there are tons of meetings that have been going on for some time with senior diplomatic officials before we actually get to this point, which is a reminder that this is, again, as the president said, probably just a first meeting before things move ahead. But it's very different from what is typically done in diplomacy.
That's for sure. And, you know, especially when it comes to logistics, to have less than a week to throw this together is considered pretty remarkable for the advance staff working at the White House. I was speaking this morning with a former advance man from the George W. Bush administration talking about what's actually inside Anchorage. It's tourist season. There are almost no hotel rooms available. Right now, there are no rental cars. So what they've actually been doing is flying vehicles, hardware, and people from the lower 48 up to Alaska just so we would have the bandwidth to carry out such a thing. I spoke with the governor of Alaska yesterday, Mike Dunleavy, said it's a good thing that it's on a military base because it's self-contained. Obviously, security is not a factor there. And it's something that made, I think, the planning a little bit easier. But for reporters, my goodness, getting up there was a bit of a challenge and a pretty expensive endeavor here. There is a hope that there will be a payoff for the media who have come from not only the United States, but Russia to actually get some questions. By the way, it's interesting to learn that some of the Russian journalists who were flying over on a charter to Alaska were served chicken Kiev.
I've heard this.
By the Russian delegation, kind of trolling, I guess, or I don't know, somehow poking fun at Ukraine on the way. It just reminds us how sensitive all of this is.
Absolutely. And I've been reading various reports about how many Ukrainians actually live in Alaska and have taken refuge there since the war began, and potentially laying low on concerns about they being immigrants, basically, and just concerned about not kind of stepping out of line, if you will, as these meetings go on. Having said that, Joe, just a reminder that this meeting between the two presidents expected to begin at 11 a.m. local time in Alaska, 3 p.m. Wall Street time. So we're talking in about 17 minutes from now. The president is scheduled to depart Alaska at 5:40 p.m. local time. So we're talking just before 9 o'clock Wall Street time. It seems like a condensed, is that a short period of time? We know that there's a bilateral meeting, a lunch meeting. You've covered a lot of these events.
Well, you know, that schedule was put forth before we heard about this working lunch. So I'm not really sure how he can possibly get out of Dodge that quickly. From the start, though, this was supposed to be a day trip. Donald Trump doesn't like to spend the night anywhere other than his own bed. So, I mean, he's going to be up and walking around and dealing with people sitting at the table the whole time that he's there. It's just a question of how long that will take. And I'll remind everybody, he not only did an interview on the way over with Fox News, he's supposed to do another one there before he leaves. And if anything keeps this president on time, it's probably a live interview on cable news. So maybe that will actually get him out of the meeting at some point before we see him talking with reporters. But that has all yet to be determined. Look, guys, on a normal day at the White House, as you well know, Carol, we could run 2-3 hours late. So this could be an even more extreme version.
As someone who runs late all the time, he's a man after my own heart. No, in some ways. All right, going to leave it there, Joe. We will certainly be watching all of your coverage. So appreciate you weighing in here as we await President Trump to step out from Air Force One. The plane has landed in Anchorage, Alaska. We are waiting to see him step down with his team, quite a large one in terms of the president's key advisors and cabinet. So again, keeping an eye on that, also looking for signs that Russian President Vladimir Putin is also on the ground. The two are expected to greet there on the tarmac. Our thanks to Joe Mathieu, co-host of Bloomberg Balance of Power. He will be covering this throughout the early evening hours here at Bloomberg. In the meantime, I'm Carol Massar, along with Emily Graffeo here on Bloomberg Businessweek Daily, just looking at our live blog. And they pointed out, as they track the meeting between these two officials, that the White House says President Trump is due to hold that joint press conference with President Putin after the meeting. Our own reporters weighing in. If it takes place, President Trump's performance will be compared against the now infamous 2018 news conference in Helsinki, which made us wanted to kind of know more, remind all of you about what happened then. And on that, we welcome Derek Wallbank. He is Bloomberg News senior editor for U.S. economy and government. He joins us from San Francisco. Derek, people might be Googling, searching to remind us what happened back in 2018. Set the scene for us on that.
Well, the Helsinki summit is one that sort of is hanging over this this anticipated gathering between Trump and Putin. And part of the reason is because it did not go well for the American president. It was one where the real highlight of the situation was Trump appearing to suggest that he was going to take Russia's word for it against U.S. intelligence analysts about what happened in Russia's role in the election that had just gone. It was widely panned, including by Trump's own party. House Speaker Paul Ryan had notably negative things to say about it, and it seemed not to go well. Now, where this is going for here is that Donald Trump is very sensitive to the idea that he does not want to seem like he's going to get played by Vladimir Putin in any sort of way, right? And so you've seen Trump in recent days kind of walk up to this summit talking about a number of things. One of them is he's kind of downplayed the chances of anything massive happen here, even as there have been, I think, hopes that there would be a pretty substantial breakthrough on the White House's side. But Trump has publicly sort of downplayed what may come out of this summit. Secondarily, there have been threats that if this doesn't go well, Trump has said he could know very quickly. He told Fox News, Brett Baer, on Air Force One headed to this summit, that he would be willing to walk away if it doesn't go well. And the White House has also sort of publicly mulled the idea that just as some of the restrictions on Russia and those affiliated with it, including India over oil buys, just as those could go down or away potentially if things go well, also there could be penalties if things ratchet up. So the White House is very sort of, I think, cognizant of those Helsinki memories, trying to make sure walking into this summit that the American president does not look like he's walking in, with some strategic disadvantage. They want him to be walking in as powerful as he possibly can be. Both something for domestic consumption, but also as a negotiating position against Vladimir Putin.
What specifically would we see out of the meeting in a best case scenario situation for Trump here, at least ending today? What would make him look really good and kind of quash those concerns that you had mentioned?
Well, I mean, look, this is an American president who has started counting up the number of conflicts around the world that he sees himself as having a role in having helped either stall or stop or pause or something like that. I mean, you're talking about Armenia and Azerbaijan. You're talking about Thailand and Cambodia. There's a fair number of things where Trump has had a role and to his credit has actually played a pretty decisive role. I'm thinking, in Thailand and Cambodia is a great example of this. Border skirmishes around the site of an ancient temple that's been contested for a long time. And Trump held up trade talks as a cudgel and basically said, look, you're not getting a trade deal as long as you two keep fighting about this. And he wound up, that was a very effective threat. Those two countries came to the table, inked a deal in Malaysia with Malaysia's prime minister looking on, facilitating that exchange, and then all three of those countries wound up with preferential reciprocal tariff rates as a result of that. So this is something where this president has seen himself as the ultimate deal maker. He's always seen himself as the ultimate deal maker. He famously wrote The Art of the Deal. And so this is somebody who says, look, for me, and I think the president has been open about this. He wants to see himself with a Nobel Peace Prize. He'd love to see that as a possibility. So I think that's kind of on the plus side. That's where the best possible thing would be for the White House, of something that comes out that legitimizes all of that, where you really meaningfully shift the trajectory of Russia's war in Ukraine, get a ceasefire, get meaningful concessions, something like that.
Well, we are, of course, awaiting President Trump to step off of Air Force One. Derek Wallbank is going to stay with us. He's Bloomberg News senior editor for U.S. economy and government out there on the West Coast. again, awaiting the president. The plane has been on the ground now, I would say about 20, 30 minutes at this point, landing just after we started at the top of this hour. Again, there with quite an entourage in terms of his administration. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Secretary of the Treasury Scott Bessent, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, CIA Director John Ratcliffe, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, Susie Wiles, White House Chief of Staff, and White House Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, among some of the key members of his team. A key member of our team, Annmarie Hordern, on the ground there in Anchorage, Alaska. Annmarie, we talked to you about 50 minutes ago at the top of the hour. What's the update here? We know the President, Trump, has landed. What do we know about President Putin at this point?
I don't like their comments.
Yeah, President Trump has landed. He's in Anchorage. He is on Air Force One, greeting with U.S. Senators Murkowski and Sullivan, as well as the governor of Alaska. The president will be holding on Air Force One until President Vladimir Putin arrives, according to the White House. So really, the start of this process is all going to begin when Vladimir Putin touches down. He is en route to Alaska, of course, from Russia. But President Trump will just hold on the tarmac, will be on Air Force One with his team having meetings, as I mentioned, with the 2 U.S. senators from Alaska, as well as the governor, before Putin arrives. Once Putin does arrive, we did get a bit of an update on how the process is going to go. Originally, and we heard this from Kremlin aide Yuri Ushakov, that it was going to be a one-on-one Putin-Trump meeting before they invited in their larger teams with the U.S. and Russian delegation. And Dmitry Peskov has said it will be about a 6 to 7 hours of potential meetings between these delegations. We've now learned that President Trump will be joined by his Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Marco Rubio, as well as his Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, who has spent countless hours with Putin since Trump's back in the White House. He was the one that's been going over to Moscow and handling these meetings. So that takes a different tone to this meeting. The president's going to be flanked by the individuals who have been working on this crisis day in and day out. And then they will be joined by their larger delegation. So for President Trump, that'll be Secretary of State Scott Bessent, as well as Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, Chief of Staff, of course, Susie Wiles. We don't know who Putin's going to have with him on the 3-3. I imagine it'll be his long-term foreign secretary, of course, that's Sergei Lavrov, and his very long-term aide, who was the former Russian ambassador to the U.S., now Kremlin aide Yuri Ushakov, who has been a part of all of these meetings, including the one that took place originally between the U.S. and Russian delegations in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
Annmarie, 6 to 7 hours is quite a long time. And Trump had been signaling that it looked like he wanted to get this meeting kind of in and out very quickly.
6 to 7 hours sounds like a lot, but when you're dealing with translation and also an individual like Vladimir Putin, who sometimes likes to go down memory lane and give you a revisionist history, sometimes something that you think could take an hour or two discussion will take a lot longer and is more labor intensive. We should note on the Russian side, for them, even though obviously this has everything to do about Putin's invasion of Ukraine of February of 2022, for the Russians, they really see this as a restart of bilateral cooperations with Washington. You have the New START treaty that is going to be ending in February of 2026. They want to talk about arms control. They want to spend a great deal of time talking about sanctions. It's probably a reason why Putin is bringing his finance minister, Anton Siluanov, to these negotiations. And they want to talk about economic cooperation on some level, whether it's energy deals, rare earth. We are just south of the Arctic Circle. That's where all the rare earth magnets are. But for this White House, President Trump made it pretty clear, speaking to reporters on his way to Alaska. He said no business can be done until the war is unwound. So what kind of concessions is Putin really going to come here and willing to give? The best case scenario would be this would be the start of a diplomatic process that could get to that end destination where Zelensky and Putin can sit around a table and figure out how they are going to actually end this war, whether that's a ceasefire, an armistice, or a real peace negotiation.
You know, we should remind everyone that we are, of course, awaiting President Trump to deplane from Air Force One. What we have learned is that Russian President Vladimir Putin is in Alaska. He has touched ground there at the tarmac. We don't yet have pictures of it. For those who are watching on TV and YouTube and Bloomberg Originals, that is, of course, Air Force One. We know that President Trump is meeting with various local officials and members of Congress. In the meantime, I think it's interesting, Annmarie, you mentioned that this 3-on-3 meeting between President Putin and President Trump. Last time we talked about the meeting in Helsinki years ago, that there were no really record of the conversation between President Trump and President Putin. There will be adults in the room this time around.
So that they can get in nicely and don't have to try to...
Well, he'll be joined by his staff and the individuals who are working on these topics at a more nuanced level. And I do think it takes on another level of seriousness, given the fact that he's going to be joined by Marco Rubio and Steve Witkoff. And Steve Witkoff is the one who's been dealing directly with Vladimir Putin to get to this day, to get to this summit. So that is remarkably different than Helsinki. Of course, Helsinki, everyone remembers the press conference. The president really in Helsinki, and Fiona Hill, his top national security expert on Russia, was recently talking about this. The president really wanted to come out and talk about nuclear proliferation, an arms treaty, arms control, and the entire press conference, of course, was taken away when he stood next to Putin and said he tended to agree with him over his own intelligence services. President Trump is going to want to avoid that when he gets in the room with the press later this evening, and that's where all the press is right now, gathering as we wait for these two men to begin the start of their summit.
All right, so appreciate it. We know it's a busy day for you. Looking forward to your continued coverage over the next few hours. Annmarie Hordern, co-host of Bloomberg Surveillance there on the ground in Anchorage, Alaska. We should point out that the Russian news agency Interfax, as we said earlier, the Russian President Vladimir Putin has arrived in Alaska. We know President Trump is already there. We've been showing pictures, certainly, of Air Force One on the tarmac, open door. But again, the president is said to be right now greeting Senators Lisa Murkowski and Dan Sullivan, and also Alaska Governor Mike Dunleavy on Air Force One while he was awaiting for President Putin to arrive. Just awaiting the two leaders there on the tarmac. That looks like the Russian president, Putin's plane there. So they're on the ground. So we should anticipate that those two leaders will be together any moment. I want to go back to Derek Wallbank. Derek, just about 30 seconds. What are you going to be looking for as these two leaders deplane?
Well, I'm going to be looking for the very first things that you see. We may not even hear them initially, but let's watch those interactions. The very, very first one. Let's watch the warmth there. We know that Trump is a big fan of firm handshakes. So let's see those initial things that we get in there, those first verbal, nonverbal cues that we might get to kind of see where this relationship could go. We are bracing for potentially hours of talks, hours plural of talks, and we'll learn a lot after this. These could be very consequential conversations, but they're all going to start with those very first interactions. Remember, Trump did say he thinks he's going to have an idea early on how this is going to go. So I'm going to be watching early on what those interactions are, what sort of warmth we get there, what sort of, even nonverbal cues, because we're looking at tenor here as much as everything. The other thing that I'm going to be watching for is, the U.S. is ready. Right. It says if things don't go well. Right. So what do those things look like?
All right, we are talking with Derek Wallbank, Bloomberg News senior editor for U.S. economy and government. Folks, a live shot of Air Force One awaiting President Trump to deplane. We know the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, his plane, too, is on the ground. Continued coverage right here on Bloomberg Businessweek.